You also write about the connection between fairy stories of the British Isles and pagan stories. There are very striking parallels. Why do you think that might be?
I think that there are some instances in Gaelic speaking Scotland, Gaelic speaking as they would say, particularly stories preserved in folklore, stories preserved in witch trials, where it's very clear that the storytellers are knowledgeable about the kind of legendarium and imaginarium that we associate with the Celtic otherworld that pretty much gets proscribed by Christianity, but that evidently remains an imaginative presence. It's worth noting at this point that, for example, Finn McCool, who's an Irish and also a Scottish hero, has a fairy wife, for instance. It's part of his story, it's part of his biography. So, in that sense, fairy beliefs and stories about fairies often are a place where there's a kind of surviving cultural residue that's otherwise been erased deliberately in order to cater for Christianity. And that becomes more problematic after the Protestant Reformation, because Protestants, and unfortunately particularly Scottish Protestants, are especially down on any pagan survivals. Indeed, one of their objections to Catholicism is that it has pagan survivals mixed in. So what might have been a kind of acceptable compromise in the 10th century becomes an intolerable and scary intrusion of something increasingly labeled as just straightforwardly diabolical by the time people are being tried for witchcraft in 1570.
So you see this kind of sometimes uneasy coexistence of, yes, what we might call pagan residue, these very, very ancient fairy stories, which are coexisting for a very long time with Christianity and are sometimes in tension, but not necessarily. I mean, what are how does the church reconcile itself with the stickiness of very old fairy stories?
It has two methods which it uses in different periods. The first method it uses is just debunking it as a lot of rubbish that only old women would say. That's pretty much the church's response up to round about the middle of the crusading era. So you have Burkhard of Worms talking about the women who fly with Diana, who's a figure that we could tentatively associate as a queen of the wild with the fairy queen. But Burkhard doesn't want to round them up and execute them or even question them. He just wants confessors to tell them that they're being silly and that their belief that they're doing that is a delusion. That's obviously pretty radically different from the kind of response that a story like that would get from a Calvinist preacher in the Church of Scotland by 1620, where if you told a story like that, how you'd flown through the night, the said Calvinist preacher would immediately conflate that with the idea of the witches' Sabbath and would suggest that you were actually flying to meet the devil. And so that kind of set of interpretations that's all about completely rejecting anything that has even a trace of paganism and extirpating it violently is something that isn't part of early Christianity, but becomes a vital part of later Christianity and is the reason that many women, and a few men too, are executed.
But the stories stick nonetheless, right? I mean, even now, I looked up some polling on the proportion of people in Britain who still believe in spirits and ghosts and fairies, and it's really, really high.
It's really interesting. A question I often ask when I do a lecture is, I often ask everyone in the room who believes in fairies to put up their hand, and usually it's sort of something under a quarter. And then I ask everyone in the room who believes there's life on other planets to put up their hands. Usually the percentage then rises to something like 80%, sometimes everyone depending on the context. And I then point out there's exactly the same amount of evidence for each of them, i.e. none.
Well, except for, I suppose, eyewitness accounts
Right,
of a
exactly.
kind.
But another secret is that every time I do a lecture, someone approaches me afterwards and says they've seen a fairy.
My husband kind of believes in ghosts. I tease him about this, and he refuses to be
It's
teased. But
good that you're willing to associate ghosts with fairies, because you're right that actually the idea of ghosts as disembodied, able to pass through walls, you can't touch them, you can't take hold of them, that's actually more recent than fairy beliefs by quite a long way. That kind of ghost is really mostly a product of the post-Enlightenment world. It's a Victorian ghost. If it's transparent, like they frequently are in films of Hamlet, where you can just sort of, he can't touch his father. Earlier periods, ghosts were really less frequent than revenants. Revenants are kind of more like we would think of vampires as this kind of creature. They hop out of their graves, they're physical. They have bodies. If they don't have a permanent body, they take somebody else's body and possess that. They don't just sort of drift around the place. I suspect your husband probably believes in the disembodied kind.
He refuses to elaborate, so I can't be sure. But I mean, it clearly is. It's well. This is presumably the reason why it is so incredibly sticky. That a very large proportion of people have an instinctive belief in the enchanted world in some fashion, which can obviously be expressed in lots of different ways, but it doesn't seem to take very much for people to believe in these kind of supernatural spirits, and also for them to be associated with particular life stages, particular phenomena. You mentioned already about childbirth and children, and stillbirth has been a particular a part of life to which fairy stories and ghost stories and all sorts of sort of supernatural ideas tend to accumulate, and also tend to be oddly consistent cross-culturally, or at least consistent across pagan and Celtic stories.
Well, I think part of that is part of the stickiness that you're talking about, is that these figures and the stories about them help us manage human feelings. For example, when thinking about the restless dead, actually it's our own restlessness that we're partly referencing. And we know that the stages of grief include denial and anger. And so one of the things that happens when we think about the dead as not lying still in their graves is that we're talking about our own sense of denial, our own inability to believe that this person who was here a minute ago can be gone now. And often people who are bereaved have this feeling that the dead person's in the next room, or that the dead person's still with them, really, and they find it very hard to reset to the absence of that person. And similarly with rage, and the next stage of grief is anger. And it's very common in stories about revenants to see the dead as furious with the living. Indeed, there's a particular kind of fairy-related emanation called the Furious Horde, which is this body of dead individuals who appear at particular times of year, characteristically round about midwinter, either side of the solstice. And they are scary. They are warriors. They are battling. They are sometimes then assumed to be in hell, really, even if we can see them. But they're also violent figures, and they are the reason we have to take our Christmas decorations down by 12th night, in case you've ever wondered.
I didn't know. I will attend to that more closely this year.